Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive that I gotta say I've been really looking forward to.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, these articles on men's mental health you shared,
Right.
especially since you mentioned wanting to find like practical advice or,
Mhm.
actual strategies.
Yeah.
So we're not just going to be looking at statistics,
Yeah.
although those are definitely important,
Right.
but really digging into the why behind them and more importantly, what we can actually do to make a difference.
Yeah. No, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is something that I think is so important, and it often gets, kind of swept under the rug.
Mm-hmm.
And all the stuff you're talking about, societal expectations, the fear of being judged, all of that can be incredibly isolating
Yeah.
for men.
Yeah.
So I think, shining a light on these issues and having these conversations is absolutely crucial.
Yeah. And one statistic from the articles really stopped me in my tracks. A staggering 75% of suicides in the UK are by men.
Wow.
That really highlights the urgency of this conversation, don't you think?
It's heartbreaking.
Oh,
And it really speaks to, I think, the pressures that men often face.
yeah.
There's this deeply ingrained societal expectation, I think, for
Yeah.
men to be stoic, to be self-reliant, to man up, to suppress any emotions that might be seen as weak or vulnerable.
Mhm.
It's almost like they're carrying this heavy weight around. They're not allowed to put it down or even acknowledge that it's heavy.
Yeah, it's like society hands them this weight labeled be strong, but forgets to give them the tools to actually deal with the emotional burden that comes with it.
Exactly. And that's why I think so many of the articles you shared emphasize open communication as being like a cornerstone of support.
Hmm.
And one thing that really resonated with me was this idea of creating a safe space for men to open up.
That makes sense, but it feels like a pretty broad concept. Like it's not exactly something you can just pull out of a hat, right?
Right.
What are your thoughts on what actually makes a conversation feel safe, especially when it comes to something as personal as mental health?
It's interesting you say that because one of the articles actually gave like a really concrete example.
Okay.
And they were talking about how men often respond well to validation that acknowledges their struggle without immediately jumping into solution mode.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, don't worry, we'll figure it out,
Yeah.
you might try something like, this sounds really tough. I can see why you're feeling this way.
Exactly. You're not dismissing their feelings.
Mhm.
You're not trying to minimize what they're going through.
Hmm.
You're meeting them where they're at with empathy.
It's like you're saying it's okay to not be okay, which I think is so powerful, especially for someone who might be struggling in silence.
Right.
The articles also touched on the importance of timing and finding the right moment for these conversations.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
Timing is crucial because, imagine trying to have like a deep heart-to-heart conversation in the middle of an argument or when someone's already feeling overwhelmed.
Right.
It's about finding those natural low-pressure moments.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's during a walk or a drive or even just hanging out at home,
Mm-hmm.
just integrating it into the flow of life rather than making it feel like this big formal intervention.
So it's almost like you're setting the stage for a conversation that feels natural and organic rather than forced or confrontational. But even when you find that right time and place, are there specific communication techniques that can help facilitate these conversations in a way that feels supportive and productive?
Absolutely. And I think, the articles you shared offered some really insightful techniques. And one that stood out to me was this concept of active listening.
Okay.
Now, I know that might sound a little obvious, like, of course we should listen.
Right.
But it's really about taking it a step further.
Okay, so it's more than just hearing the words. What does active listening actually look like in practice?
It's about really absorbing what the other person is saying, both verbally and non-verbally. It's almost like, when you're telling a friend about a problem, and instead of just saying, oh, no, that's awful, they say, wow, so you're feeling completely blindsided by this. That must be so frustrating. They're reflecting back your emotions and making sure they truly understand.
So it's not just passively listening, it's actively engaging with what the other person is saying and reflecting it back to them.
Precisely. And the article highlighted how important this can be for men in particular who might be hesitant to express their feelings directly.
Yeah.
It shows them that you're not just hearing their words, you're hearing their heart.
That's such a powerful distinction. And it makes me think about another point the articles brought up, the types of questions we ask. They mentioned open-ended questions as being particularly effective in these conversations. What are your thoughts on that?
Open-ended questions are fantastic because they can't be answered with a simple yes or no. They invite deeper reflection and they encourage the other person to share more. Like instead of asking, are you feeling stressed? Which can feel a bit like an interrogation almost.
Right.
You could say, what's been weighing on your mind lately? Or how do you usually handle stressful situations? Those subtle shifts in phrasing can make a world of difference.
Yeah, it's about inviting them to share at their own pace without feeling pressured to have all the answers figured out.
Right.
Which actually reminds me of another point the article's made about how men don't always need solutions.
Yes.
Sometimes they just need to be heard and understood.
Absolutely. Sometimes the most supportive thing we can do is simply listen with empathy, validate their feelings, and let them know that they're not alone in what they're going through. It's about creating that space where they feel safe, expressing their vulnerability without judgment.
It's about holding space for their emotions, even if we don't fully understand what they're going through. And that actually makes me think about recognizing those red flags, those subtle signs that someone might be struggling.
Right.
The articles all touched on the importance of being attuned to these signs. What are some of the key things we should be looking out for?
You're right, because those red flags can be easy to miss if we're not paying attention. And like we were talking about earlier, men aren't always the best at expressing their emotions directly.
Right.
So it's not always going to be as obvious as them saying, I'm feeling depressed.
Right. It's often more subtle than that.
Yeah.
What are some of those less obvious signs?
One of the articles gave a really helpful example, and it talked about how a sudden loss of interest in hobbies or activities that someone used to enjoy can be a sign that something's not right.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Like that friend who used to love playing basketball and suddenly they don't want to go to the court anymore.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or someone who is really into their music just stops playing their guitar.
Exactly. And it can also manifest in changes in sleep patterns, either sleeping too much or too little, increased irritability, difficulty concentrating, withdrawing from social situations.
It's like that pressure cooker analogy we talked about earlier. If those emotions aren't given a healthy outlet, they might find release in other ways, like through anger, isolation, or even physical symptoms.
You hit the nail on the head. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to these shifts in behavior, even if they seem small or insignificant at first. Early intervention can make a world of difference.
So it's about noticing those changes and having the courage to say something.
Yes.
Not in a confrontational way,
Right.
but from a place of genuine care and concern.
Precisely. And sometimes that conversation might lead to a larger discussion about seeking professional help.
Yes.
Which is another point that the articles really emphasized.
The articles really highlighted the importance of normalizing therapy, especially for men who often face that added layer of stigma.
It's true.
Yeah.
There's still this misconception that seeking help is a sign of weakness.
Right.
Which couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah.
In reality, seeking help is a sign of incredible strength and self-awareness.
It takes courage to admit you need support. And even more courage to actually reach out and get it.
I love how you put that. And the good news is there are so many resources available. You even mentioned a couple in your notes, Mind and Samaritans.
Yes. Both incredible organizations doing such important work in the mental health space.
And what I found really interesting is that Samaritans actually have a dedicated helpline specifically for men.
Oh, wow.
Which I thought spoke volumes about their understanding of the unique challenges men face in seeking help.
That's fantastic to know. Having those tailored resources can be so helpful. Were there any other specific resources mentioned in the articles that stood out to you?
One thing that I found really practical and actionable was the suggestion to look into local community centers.
Oh, yeah.
They often have support groups specifically for men, or they can connect individuals with therapists who specialize in men's mental health.
That's such a good point. Sometimes we overlook those local resources, but they can be invaluable. It's also a good reminder that support doesn't always have to look like traditional therapy. There are so many different avenues people can explore based on their individual needs and preferences. It's true, there really isn't just one right way to approach mental health. And that actually makes me think of something else from the articles, this idea about the connection between mental and emotional well-being.
Right.
Especially for men. What are your thoughts on that connection?
I think that's such a crucial point and one that often gets overlooked. We tend to think about mental and emotional health as these separate things, but in reality, they're so deeply intertwined. They're almost like two sides of the same coin.
Like you can't really address one without addressing the other.
Exactly. And I think for men in particular, there's often this conditioning to suppress emotions, to not appear too sensitive or emotional.
Yeah, it's that age-old saying, boys don't cry. Which, looking back, maybe it wasn't the most helpful message.
Not really, no. Because bottling up emotions doesn't make them disappear.
Right.
It often just intensifies them.
Right.
Think about it like a pressure cooker. If you keep adding pressure without releasing any of it, eventually something has to give.
And that release can manifest in so many unhealthy ways. It's like those suppressed emotions are searching for an escape route, whether it's through anger, isolation, or even physical symptoms.
Absolutely. You're spot on. That's why creating that space for men to acknowledge and validate their emotions is so crucial. And sometimes that's all it takes, just having someone listen without judgment, without trying to fix it, and just acknowledge that what they're feeling is valid and understandable.
It's about creating that space where vulnerability is actually a strength, not a weakness. And this leads perfectly into what I really want to leave our listeners with today. If there's one thing you take away from this deep dive, it's that you have the power to be a source of support for the men in your life.
Absolutely. Every conversation, every act of empathy can make a difference. Breaking down the stigma surrounding men's mental health is a collective effort, and it starts with each and every one of us.
So true. It's about creating a world where men feel just as comfortable talking about their mental health as they do their physical health. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.